Today is the meeting of Lincoln Safe and Successful Kids Interlocal Board. The Open Meetings Act is posted in the back of the room. May we please do a roll call of members present?
Barb Byer.
Here.
James Michael Bowers.
Here.
Kathy Danick.
Here.
Larry and Gaylor Baird.
Here.
Piyush Srivastav. Brody Weber.
Here.
Next up is approval of the minutes. I'll request a motion and a second approving the minutes of the September 28th meeting. Moved by School Board Member Danick, seconded by School Board Member Byer. Any discussion? Seeing none, may we please do a roll call vote on the approval of the minutes?
Barb.
Yes.
James Michael.
Yes.
Kathy.
Yes.
Larian.
Yes.
Piyush.
Yes.
Brody.
Yes.
Okay, we are coming up to public comments for items not listed on the agenda. The Safe and Successful Kids Interlocal Board welcomes comments from fellow citizens. At this time, we are taking public comment on any topic not listed on the agenda. Opportunity to comment on agenda items will come at a later point. All public comments and presentations will be limited to 5 minutes. Ms. Granquist is our timer and will alert you when your 5 minutes have concluded. Speakers may note that their support for comments presented by a preceding speaker. Please state your name, spell your name, and indicate your address at the beginning of your comments for the record of this meeting. If you plan to speak today, please sign in on the speaker sheet with Ms. Granquist if you have not already done so. Is there anyone here to speak on items not on the agenda? Okay, seeing none, we will go ahead and move on. Next up is report regarding school resource officers. There's 3 primary areas funded with the Safe and Successful Kids Interlocal: proactive services, preventative services, and protective services. Today's presentation relates to the last category, school resource officers. Today I'm going to introduce Crime Analysis Manager Jeff Peterson and Crime Analyst Tricia Todd with LPD. Also, Dr. Rob Tarfer from the ESU 18 Assessment and Evaluation Team. This group will present the annual report and data regarding the SRO program, the School Perception Survey, and school discipline.
And I am not Jeff, Tricia, or Rob, but my name is John Neal. I'm sorry to throw a curve. I work with Lincoln Public Schools, and I'm just going to give a brief history or background to the report to provide a little bit more depth before we start. For those people that might be viewing at home and might not know much about the report's history. So if you indulge me just for a few minutes, I'd also like to ask a little bit of an indulgence. We have a very long presentation today, and some of the data early in the presentation is then informed by data later in the presentation, especially as you compare LPD data and what's in the LPS data, and then you look at our overall takeaways. We ask whenever possible if you could jot down your questions, and then we can do questions at the very end, as some questions will be answered as we go along. But we also don't want to lose you as we go along, so please stop us at any time and ask us a question for clarification. I'd like to begin by thanking those people you mentioned before, Jeff Peterson, Tricia Todd with LPD, Rob McIntarfer with LPS, who are here tonight, and also Dr. Don Mazzi and Dr. Bethany Brunsman, who work with Dr. McIntarfer at LPS for putting this report together. To begin with, there is a long history of Lincoln Public Schools in the city of Lincoln working towards safe school and community environments. And the SRO program is one piece of that broader perspective of having a safe, welcoming environment for students and families in Lincoln. Then within that, LPS and LPD combine to make the SRO program. And they really have both a team approach but also individual roles. LPS is responsible for handling the school discipline that occurs in schools. The school resource officer is there to handle legal issues when they arise. But they work as a partner team in making those decisions and in providing support to students, to families, and community members in the school community. So they really also make up a team. It's this duality of purposes that make it all work. They have individual roles, but they work collaboratively together throughout. This had never been captured before, but when the Safe and Successful Kids Interlocal Board was an initial concept, we were looking for approval back in 2018, and we're thinking about reintroducing school resource officers to middle school. people wanted to be more thoughtful. The community asked us to be more thoughtful about what really is the purpose of SROs and how would we measure that. So Lincoln Public Schools, the Lincoln Police Department came together with a memorandum of understanding that identified 6 specific goals. And you'll see us measure those goals and talk about those goals in the report today. The memorandum of understanding requires that a report sharing, measuring progress toward the 6 goals come each year, and that it's shared with the City of Lincoln, Lincoln Public Schools, and to the extent possible, made available online. The annual review started in 2020. That was the first year we shared it, and we've shared it each year since then. And it's a requirement for LPD and LPS to use the results of that annual review to make modification and improve the program. It's not just to create the data, it's to learn from the data and to continue to evolve and provide better service. So to accomplish that process, it was really important, included in the memorandum of understanding, that we included the community in the process. So that very first year we held an open to the community meeting. It was held at School Middle School, and had lots of people from the community come share their concerns, share their hopes, share their dreams for the program, and their cautions. And so from that, the report you see was developed to answer the questions they thought were most important to be answered by the community if it went beyond those 6 goals. 6 goals plus the extension. To fulfill its purpose, there we have data measuring the SRO program, perception data from parents, staff, and students measuring their thoughts about the experience with SROs, and discipline data regarding suspensions and expulsions of LPS. And what's really important is we're sharing this with you tonight. It's available publicly online, recorded and available later, and we also have available in 3 different forms online. We have a 1-pager, we have a short summary, and then we have the longer report, and then the PowerPoint. And you will notice in the PowerPoint on the slides, there's a page reference. That reference goes to the full report. So we might show just a table, but if you go to the page in the full report referenced on the PowerPoint slide, it will let you read in greater detail how that data was generated. So with that, that's the background of the report and what brings us here today. And now I'd like to introduce Jeff Peterson with Lincoln Police Department, or Tricia Todd, crime analysis with Lincoln Police Department, to continue.
Hello, hello. I'm Tricia Todd, a crime analyst with the Lincoln Police Department, one of a few of us. And I was the one assigned to collect, analyze, and present the data for you today. As Dr. Neal stated, we have a ton of information to get through, so I will dive right in. First of all, calls for service. I'll make a couple notes that the COVID years, 1920, 2021, are not included in this portion of the report, but you will see the 4-year average referenced frequently. That's school year 15-16 to school year 18-19. That's the pre-implementation of SROs in the middle schools. So you'll see that throughout the report, and that's always going to be shown in the light green, if it printed out in the right colors, hopefully. This most recent school year is going to be shown in the dark blue, 22-23. And going into calls for service, a call for service can be defined as an incident where the presence of an officer is requested. Anyone can initiate it, and they can range from a lost cell phone to an assault in progress. During the prior 4 years, the police department responded to, on average, 1,310 calls for service at Lincoln middle and high schools. This most recent year, that number is 1,443, which shows a 10% increase. If your eyes are not already looking at the middle school on the left-hand side of your screen, that stair step up from the 4-year average shows an 85% increase. With the addition of SROs, some of that makes sense, but we will revisit that here in the next couple slides. Looking at what types of calls for service happens at the schools, these top 12 call for service types represent 74% of all of the calls for service this last year. Once again, that green is showing the 4-year average, dark blue showing this most recent year. We know that calls for service are up 10%, so here we can take a closer look at where some of those increases have happened. It's obviously important to look at how many juvenile referrals are happening as a result of the calls for service. And a juvenile referral is when an officer or an SRO has probable cause that a juvenile has committed a criminal act and they're referred to the county attorney's office. It's the adult equivalent of a citation. During the prior 4 years, LPD issued referrals during 402 calls for service. This most recent year, that number is 265, which represents a 34% decrease. Looking once again at that left-hand side at the middle school, you'll see that despite that 85% increase in calls for service at the middle schools, that the referrals have remained virtually unchanged. Moving to the right side, the left side is raw numbers and the right side is going to be the percentages of the calls for service. So what percent of calls for service result in a referral? During the 4-year average, that was 31%. This most recent year, that's 18%. So who's calling? Consistently, teachers and staff initiate the highest percent of calls for service. However, this year, administrators rose to the number 2 spot with 22%. And that 22% is actually showing a 56% increase for calls for service initiated by administrators over the 4-year average. A quick coding note on this data. The unknown category was removed this year. Within the data, it's almost synonymous with other citizen. And also this year, we have an increased knowledge of how officer-generated calls for service look. So some of those are being more accurately captured under officer-initiated calls for service. Diving in a little deeper on that, who's initiating calls for service that result in a referral? Once again, consistently, teachers and staff and administrators initiate the highest percent. However, this year, administrators take the top spot, initiating 39% of calls for service that result in a referral. Their combined total is 73%. And I'm not sure if you've noticed on the who initiated calls for service, but it looks like there was an increase in officer-initiated calls for service, but you'll see that calls for service that result in a referral remain the same as last year at 3% and down slightly from the 4-year average for calls for service by officers. So what types of incidents result in a referral? There's a top 6 crime types that represent 83% of calls for service with a referral. Of those top 6, that's 221 out of the 265. 76 of those are initiated by teachers, staff, or administrators, and SROs or other officers initiated less than 1%. The top 2 crime types on here you'll see are assault and narcotics. And we know that calls for service resulting in a referral are down 34% this year. So on this slide, you can see where some of those decreases have happened. Looking at those top 2 crime types, we wanted to see who was initiating those calls for service. Assault on the left-hand side. Teachers, staff, and administrators initiated 74% of assault calls for service, and SROs or other officers initiated 2. Moving over to the right side for narcotics, teachers, staff, and administrators initiated 96% of those calls for service, with 72% coming from administrators. Documentation that an administrator was notified during a call for service with the referral occurred 90% of the time. There's 10% or 26 calls for service where the notification of an administrator is unknown. It could have happened and not made it into the police report. It could have happened outside of the school or outside of school hours. But if you want more information on those 26, you can look at actually page 26 of your full report. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Jeff Peterson.
Good evening. Before I get started, I need to give the proper props to Tricia Todd. She came on board 372 days ago, and within the first week, she was advised to attend this meeting last year, and then she was directed, or she was asked to take over this project. And she's done just an incredible job. Not only did she take over the project, but she's owned it. She's taken ownership, and everything you see on the LPD side and assistant LPS as well. That's Tricia Tosh. She's done an amazing job. So just have to give her proper credit for the work that she's done, because it's absolutely incredible. Moving on, we're going to talk about the disparity index. And what you see in front of you right there are just some raw numbers. We've made a movement to make sure we're extremely transparent with numbers. And this gives the viewers, the board, the public, the ability to take these numbers and do their own calculations on disparity index. It's a complex topic. What we also did this year with LPS took a hold of this, and that was we moved from the NCIC of how we count races to the census. NCIC is the law enforcement way of counting the demographics. LPS decided that the census provided a much better accuracy, and it does. It's just much more accurate than NCIC. NCIC has been in place for a number of decades, and we believe these numbers provide a much better reflection of the disparity index. So the numbers reflect for the past 2 school years of these race demographics. Now, to understand the disparity index, we look at sort of a baseline, and that baseline is a 1. Anything over, anything under, we want to move towards that center. So over 1 is overrepresentation, and under 1 is underrepresentation. So we're trying to move everything right in the middle, and I think LPS is looking at that 1.2 line for that range. So on the next several slides, you're going to see a red bar, and that's that 1.0. We want to be right at that, or give or take just a little bit. To understand the disparity index, here's an example of 10,000 students in our population. Of those 10,000 students, on average, 10% or 1,000 were absent 5 or more times. So that's our baseline. That's our 1 right there. Now in demographic A, we have 2,000 students and 200 were absent 5 or more times. That's 10%. That's that baseline. So demographic A, group A, is at that baseline. Group B, demographic B, we have 1,000 students with 200 students that were absent 5 or more times. That's 20%. That's that 2.0. So that's double of the baseline that we're looking at. So keep that in mind as we look at these next several charts. And we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail of these charts. Just going to give you an idea where these numbers lie. Victims. A victim is anywhere from an assault, having something stolen, and we've had over, I believe, 700 victims in the 2022-2023 data. But we also have to look at the missing persons. So take a look at the missing persons, because we have 118 missing persons. So keep that in mind. Of the 746 or whatever it is, 118 were missing persons. And most of those are just, they're walking away from the home and then they're coming back later that night. But they're a victim. So those numbers are also reflected in the victim disparity index for both middle school and high school. There you see that baseline and the disparity that's over the baseline, the African Americans, Native Americans. We also have to understand that the lower the numbers for a certain population tends to dictate the massive changes in the disparity index. So if we have a low population in a certain demographic, and then we see a increase of 3 or 4 in one of that demographics, that disparity index can really go up or go down. So keep that in mind with some of these. It's really controlled by lower numbers. And again, we have raw numbers there to give that transparency, give that foundation of what all these numbers mean. Suspect and the PRs. PRs, persons responsible. So those are the ones that are being referred. This year, the PRs, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tricia, Todd, the PRs are listed if they are directly referred. Previous years, it was not necessarily a referral was done, but they were listed as a PR. Suspect means the officer believed they were a suspect, but there's not enough for any type of referral or to list them as a person responsible. So again, you see the red line and the demographics that go over the red line and the demographics that are under the red line. So even though we have a decrease in, say, the white category from 2021-22 to this year, we want to see that decrease actually increase anything that's under that red line. We'd like, because we want to balance that out. And again, the raw numbers for each of those categories. A disparity index for middle school. Left side of the chart is victims. Right side of the chart is suspects and PRs. And again, the raw numbers. You can really see the fluctuations in some of those categories. I believe the Native American category, we went from, in the suspects and PRs, we had 4 students in 2021, 2022 to 3 students in 2022 to 2023. So just that one change causes that significant change in the numbers. So keep this in mind as you look at the data and try to understand where these bar charts and that red line and how these numbers, the lower numbers, can really change that number. Disparity index for high school. Again, victims on the left side, suspects and PRs on the right side, and those raw numbers. Some key takeaways. Past years, both African Americans and Native Americans were represented in the previous years, and that continues to be the case for 2022 and 23. Historically, like I mentioned in the first slide, we've gone with the NCIC category of the demographics, and then we switched to the census data. We only have the census groupings for 2021, 2023, so those 2 categories. We do not have that for the previous years. It's a tremendous amount of work, and I have to thank, I don't recall her last name, but Dr. Bethany. She did a lot of this work, and it's an incredible amount of work to figure out these calculations and to change all the categories from NCIC to the census groups. Just a few general comments. Various programs occurring within the LPS and by LPD. LPD was, there was 5 complaints against the school resource officers during this last school year. All of them were exonerated. Commendations, there was 3 for a variety of events this past school year. Training, they averaged 48 hours of school resource training this past year. Last year was 49, so right on par for last year. And then presentations. The school resource officers do a number of presentations in the middle school and high school, and there you see the overall numbers reaching 2,700 students. And this is probably the biggest takeaway from all the LPD data, and that is the perception that having school resource officers in the middle school and high schools create a school to prison pipeline. This shows that it's not even close to occurring. So out of the 22,000 students at LPS, 2 were referred, and you can see that percentage. Out of the 265 referrals, only 2 were referred, for less than 1%. So 2 lodges out of all the calls for service, out of the 1,400 calls for service, only 2 lodges. And that's all I have. I'll turn it over to Dr. McIntyre.
Hi, everybody. Rob McIntyre, Supervisor Assessment Evaluation Team, Lincoln Public Schools. Some of you have heard some of these data before or seen this version of this presentation before, others haven't. We're talking about a lot of data, as Jeff and Tricia referenced, there are a lot of data that are coming at you. Our partners in the LPD focused on the calls for service data that just take you through. So now we're switching gears a little bit. On the LPS side of the SRO evaluation, we mainly try to look at two different things. We try to look at perception of the SRO program by three different populations: students, parents, and staff. So you're about to see a lot of perception data. This is survey data, self-reports about attitudes regarding different aspects of the SRO program. So we'll do that for a little while, and then we switch gears to the other half of the LPS data that Dr. Neal already referred to. We're talking about discipline, but instead of calls for service discipline that Jeff and Tricia talked with you about, this is in-school discipline. This is out-of-school suspensions, in-school suspensions, and expulsions. So that's what's facing you. So we're about to launch into a lot of data, first perception and then discipline. We also want to highlight that this is all relevant to what we're all talking about all year in LPS, and for years to come, we're talking about the board equity goals. The SRO evaluation and the data that we're about to present are all very relevant to the different board equity goals, looking at possible disparities and differential impacts across different demographic groups regarding everything we do in Lincoln Public Schools, including discipline and including perception of the SRO, of the school resource officers. So we're starting with perception data. Some of you have experienced the perception data because you have students who are in Lincoln Public Schools, so you may have been able to take the parent perception survey. You'll know that the survey measures a lot of different self-report attitudes about Lincoln Public Schools. We're only talking about a fraction of it here. There are several different sections. We talk about curriculum, instruction, and assessment. We talk about relationships. We talk about engagement. We talk about culture and climate. Fortunately, we're not doing all of that tonight. We're just looking at the aspects of the perception survey that are directly relevant to the school resource officers. On the student side of things, here are the raw numbers for our student responses. We have a fairly high return rate from students. We always wish it would be higher. Here are the raw numbers of respondents for the student survey. We were very happy that the student survey was up 13% this year, by the way, our return rate. Those of you who have heard this report before, we emphasized in some Q&A, I'm not sure if it was here last year or if it was in a different meeting, but in some of the questions, we talked about ways to increase return rate, and that will especially become relevant when we talk about the increase in the parent return rate. These are some new graphics for those of you who've seen this last year. You're going to see two different kinds of data representation as we go through. On all of the perception survey items that are dichotomous, all the items that are yes, no, or all the items that are yes, no, maybe, we made these stacked bar graphs. This is an improvement from what we believe we presented in years past. So at a glance on these slides, on these data representations, you can see the number of people in each demographic group who responded to each of these items, and you can look quickly down and see the relative proportionality across the different demographic groups of who said yes and who said no. We also want to highlight on this item, this is a brand new item that we added to the perception data this year based on your feedback. Your feedback in other groups said, so it's wonderful that you've asked these different perceptions of the school resource officers. How about cutting the chase and just asking students, do you feel more, first, are you aware that there's a school resource officer at your school? We're going to show you in a minute the item about do you feel more safe? So first we filter down based on all the students who are aware that there is a school resource officer on their campus. And then we do a demographic breakdown. This is the second style of slide that you'll see. This is what's called a Likert item, and many of you experienced this, where respondents are asked to use a 1 to 4 scale from not at all true to completely true. This is the new item. I feel more safe with the SRO on campus. So of the students who are aware that there's a school resource officer, the students who responded somewhat true, mostly true, or completely true to this item are indicating that they at least feel a little bit more safe at their school because of the presence of the school resource officer that they're afraid of. As you look at these items, please look at the red, yellow, and green bars on this item, somewhat, mostly, or completely, and you can mentally stack up those items. You notice that across the different demographic groups, with very little differences, students in each demographic group report feeling at least a little bit more safe. It's also important to think about the not at all true category. The students who responded that this is not at all true, that they don't necessarily feel more safe, they're not necessarily saying that they feel less safe. They're just saying there's an increase in their perception of safety. They may feel less safe, those students who responded not at all true, but they may feel equally safe. But you can see across the board, across the different demographic groups, it's fairly consistent that students are telling us that I'm aware of the school resource officer and they help me feel more safe at my school. Then we ask students, this is related to a slide that Jeff just recently presented about presentations at school. Has the SRO presented any of your classes? Notice that most students say no. As Jeff and Tricia and LPD continue to gather more careful evidence and more complete evidence about presentations, we expect this to change in the future. Students are a little mixed about whether that presentation was useful. A lot of students said yes, but it's definitely not above 50%. Notice the relatively small number of students across all demographic groups who reported that an SRO actually contacted them about an issue at school. This matches with the data that Jeff and Tricia just represented to you, that there have been some increases and some decreases in SRO contact with calls for service, but it's definitely a smaller minority of our students, and that's represented here in the student self-report. Of those very small number of students, remember we've filtered down even farther now. We're talking about a relatively small number of students, and you can see that represented on this slide. Of that small number of students, we asked those students who had contact with an SRO several questions about their perception of that contact and of that interaction. Here, you can again add up the red, yellow, and green bars. Students who indicated that it's at least somewhat true that the SRO listened to my side of the story. I like to emphasize the yellow and green bars. The students who said it's mostly true or completely true that the SRO listened to my side of the story. You can see the patterns on this item are also relatively the same across different demographic groups. What we're looking for are disparities between different demographic groups and perceptions of incidents like this or perceptions of situations like this about the SRO listening to their side of the story. The pattern is very similar when we ask them a similar question but in a different way. I was treated safely and with respect, and whether the SRO behaved professionally. So, across the student perception survey, 13% more students responded to the perception survey last year, but the patterns are very similar to previous years. Students report overall that they are aware that the SRO is present. Those students who are aware the SRO is present, they indicate that yes, the SRO makes them feel more safe at school. And the small number of students who had contact with the SRO generally report fairly positive perceptions of their interaction with the SRO officer. And the patterns are similar across different demographic groups. So if you got that, if you wrapped your head around the student side, get ready to use everything you just learned with these second two surveys. We're going to do the same thing about parents, and we're going to do the same things about staff. Might seem a little bit repetitious, but it's important to us to get different angles on the story, basically. We're triangulating across all this data, and again, looking across demographic groups for anything that jumps out at us. Generally, what we see is consistency again this year, just like we did last year. So, proving that, or our evidence for that, here are the respondents on the parent perception survey. These numbers still are not as high as we want them to be, but it's better this year. The parent response rate is up 31% for last year versus years before. Our team worked with Mindy Burbach and the excellent communication team. There she is. We developed new communication with parents. We developed a specific landing page that was designed specifically for parents so that when they click through, they get to a landing page that emphasizes the importance of the survey and what is done with the survey data. And we think that's largely responsible for the increased response rate. We still wish we could get a lot more parents. We especially wish we could get a lot more parents that were across different demographic groups. The lower the numbers in each demographic group, it limits our ability to make inferences about how that demographic group generally feels across these different perception items. And sometimes you'll see this especially in the staff data, we just can't report because the items are too low in that demographic group. There's an example of that here. We didn't have enough responses from parents in the Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander demographic group to report. So when you see blanks in these data representations, it's because the numbers are just simply too low. You can see across the demographic groups, parents who report that they are aware that there's a school resource officer. Proportions similar, a little bit lower to students, which makes sense. Students are there more often than parents are. Of the parents who were aware that there's an SRO on campus, have you met the school resource officer? The numbers drop below again. Notice how low the numbers get here. Has the SRO been in contact with your student about an issue this year? Again, there are a lot of calls for service, but relative to the size of Lincoln Public Schools, it's a minority across all demographic groups. Of this very small number of parents, we ask the similar perception questions that we ask with students. So we asked students, and students reported that yes, the SRO listened, the SRO was respectful, the SRO is professional. Parents report similar patterns. Look at the yellow bars and look at the green bars here of parents who said agree and strongly disagree with the SRO listened to my student. My student was treated fairly in this situation. Again, we hope to get an increased response rate so we could report out for more demographic groups, but we're not there yet. Treated my student with respect and behaved in a professional manner. Very similar patterns. We added one, the SRO was considerate of my student's feelings, but the pattern still stayed the same. Then overall, the SRO did a good job of handling this issue that happened with my student at our school. Key takeaways from the parent perception survey. Similar to students, parents are as positive or more positive about the interactions between SROs and their students. Because of the low numbers of responses, we can't be confident about inferences across all demographic groups because we just don't have enough responses. Last, this is the third verse of the song. This is the certified staff survey. We send a similar perception survey out to all staff members, and we also ask them about SROs. In Lincoln Public Schools, one of the board equity goals is to increase the diversity of our staff. We are very serious about that, and our excellent Human Resources Department is working very hard on it. And it is very challenging in Lincoln, Nebraska, as you might imagine. Still working on increasing the diversity of staff. Since we are still working on the increasing the diversity of staff, it's not possible for us to receive many staff perception survey responses from diverse staff who are not present in our staff. So we hope these numbers change, and we expect these numbers to change in the future. So you'll see a lot of blanks on these slides. Most staff have observed the school resource officer interacting with students because of an issue. Of those staff who have observed that interaction, almost all of them agree or strongly agree with the perception item the SRO listened. Almost exactly the same proportion said that the SRO treats all individuals fairly and with respect. So the key takeaway from the staff is very similar to the other ones. So what we see is triangulation. What we think we are seeing, and we're making inferences that when the SROs do interact with students in Lincoln Public Schools, it is a smaller number relative to the size of the school. But even within that population that has the most direct contact with SROs, when we ask them about that incident, no matter whether they're students, parents, or staff, they see evidence of positive interactions in those sometimes very difficult situations and stressful situations. So that wraps up the perception side of things. Please mentally switch gears, because now we're going to look at some very different kinds of data, and the data representations on this side are different as well. We noticed again this year, similar to last year, that there are slightly more discipline incidents, slightly more LPS discipline incidents last year. We will note those on some slides. We'll tell you about the relative proportions of increases in in-school and out-of-school suspensions. This did not increase. It is not true about expulsions. But with suspensions, we noticed still more increases in last year as we did in previous years. but the increase is proportional across demographic groups. This is our COVID caveat slide. Everybody's got a COVID caveat slide where we tell you what years. Please don't consider the COVID years representative because we don't believe they are. So we try to emphasize those in the slides as well. In the next data representations you'll see, what we do is we indicate overrepresentation in a slightly different way than you heard Jeff describe. Jeff described using the disparity index to indicate overrepresentation. We're over 1.0 and we're using 1.2 to indicate overrepresentation. We did it in a slightly more simple way because we're just dealing with proportions. Anytime you see a cell in any of these tables that's highlighted in pink, that indicates that that group is overrepresented in that discipline event. So an example. I'll get to an example in a second. Here are some definitions of the different kinds of LPS discipline incidents. In LPS, we know as teachers that's impossible for people to listen and to read at the same time, so we'll pause for 30 seconds while you read those definitions. That's also a fantastic excuse to drink my coffee. We're going to cover in-school suspensions first. So this level of discipline incident, and you read about what kind of student behaviors may result in in-school suspensions. In last year, that many secondary students, 11.4%, experienced at least one in-school suspension during the course of the year. This is slightly higher than the previous year. So as you look at the rest of these proportions, please remember that you're thinking about 2,644 students relative to all the secondary students in Lincoln Public Schools. We first look at gender demographics. Here's your first example of overrepresentation. All the students who identify as male are overrepresented in the in-school suspension group in both middle school and high school. We also put the N equals the population sizes down below, so you can see how that 2,644 students divide up between middle school and high school. So males are overrepresented in in-school suspensions. This will also be a trend that you'll see across in-school suspensions and out-of-school suspensions. Students who identify, or families who identify as Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, or two or more races, are overrepresented in in-school suspensions. It's fairly consistent across middle school and high school. You'll notice there are a little bit of changes in high school in some of the years, but last year the pattern repeated itself of Black or African American, Hispanic, or two or more race students being overrepresented in in-school suspensions in high school. We also look at different demographics. We have access to students, records of students who receive special education services, who receive English language services, and who participate in the free reduced lunch program. We want to make sure, in addition to race ethnicity demographics, we want to look for disparate impacts on students who receive these special services as well. You'll see this pattern repeat in in-school suspension and out-of-school suspension. Students who receive special education services and students who participate in the free reduced lunch program in both middle school and high school are overrepresented in in-school suspensions, not students who participate in English language learner services. That has been fairly consistent over the years, and it was consistent 21-22 versus 22-23. So our takeaways for our in-school suspensions we already highlighted, and just foreshadowing, saying as a former English teacher, foreshadowing, you'll see these same patterns in out-of-school suspensions, but we want to show you those tables as well. Out-of-school suspensions. A similar number of students experience the slightly more serious discipline action of out-of-school suspensions for more serious discipline incidents, more serious and potentially dangerous behaviors. 2,360 secondary students, 10.1%. Again, this is slightly higher than the previous year, 9.6. We wouldn't call the difference between in-school and out-of-school suspensions over the years a dramatic increase from one year to another, but Ryan Zabawa and his excellent team are working very hard on training and professional learning and different kinds of interventions to try to head off behaviors before these suspension incidents occur. So we hope to have a different story to tell you in future years. We'll briefly show you the same tables. For out-of-school suspensions, males are also overrepresented at both middle school and high school for out-of-school suspensions. The same disparities exist across demographic groups in out-of-school suspensions that they do in-school suspensions. And then we again look at special education, ELL, English language learners, and free reduced lunch. This pattern may look different in middle school than it did in middle school out-of-school suspensions than it did in middle school in-school suspensions, because that middle column in the middle school table is all pink. But notice that it's just barely above the overall population. It is not very much above. We just colored it pink if it was above the overall population at all. If we're going to compute the disparity index like LPD does, that would be a very, very low disparity index and might be in that between 1 and 1.2 level, where we would consider it almost flat. Takeaways from out-of-school suspensions. The one new point to point out here, we may be seeing less disparity. We hope that we are seeing the beginning of a pattern in lower amounts of disparity for students receiving special education services and free reduced lunch program in out-of-school suspensions. We hope that is the beginning of a trend, and we're going to be watching that trend in future years to make sure to try to see if that's still going down, because that's obviously good news. But we're not seeing much change in disproportionality based on race ethnicity. Okay, hurtling towards the end, promise. Please notice the difference in numbers here. For in-school suspensions and for out-of-school suspensions, we were talking about 2,500 to 2,700 students who experienced those discipline events. Expulsion for the most serious student behaviors is a blessedly rare event in Lincoln Public Schools due to a lot of people's efforts to keep students in school. Only 77 students experienced expulsion. That's 0.3% of the secondary population. This is slightly lower than the previous year, but relatively just flat because we're dealing with very, very small numbers here. So in the rest of these tables, realize we're only talking about 77 students. Even in the small population, males are, students who identify as male are overrepresented. We see the same patterns of disparity by ethnicity in the very small expulsion group as we do in school and out of school suspension across middle school and high school. Similar disparities in special education, ELL, and free reduced lunch. Also, although notice over on the high school side in 21-22, we did not see any disparity in expulsions among students who receive special education services, but that popped back up again last year to 21%. So takeaways and expulsions, it's difficult to know what patterns are when numbers get this low. Jeff and Tricia talked about that very effectively during their part of the presentation. To really know whether any of these are trends, we're going to be watching it for years. We don't want expulsions to go up, so we'll basically have to bank data over years in order to really identify trends that we can make confident inferences from. So with that, I turn it back over to Dr. Neal, and then we'll be ready for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Mark.
Yep.
What we'll share here are some overall takeaways, all the data that you've seen, as well as the full report that you can look at in the future is utilized in helping to make decisions, helping to improve our practices. But we're going to share 4 major takeaways that we look at when we talk about how we're moving forward as a whole program. So the first one is not a takeaway, but it's an important data point that I want to describe, and that is the calls for service leading to referral in middle school students. In 2018, when we looked at reintroducing school resource officers into middle schools, one of the questions of the community was whether the introduction of school resource officers into the middle school compared to when a school would have to call an officer off the street to come into the building, whether just having them in the school would increase the calls for service and increase the referrals, and part of the concern was that school to prison pipeline. More students would be in juvenile court because of that relationship. Since we've been doing this report, we have not ever reported an increase comparing the calls for service for referrals for middle school students when compared to the 4-year average. It's always been below. That number's gone up and down at different times, but it's never exceeded where our 4-year average is. As we move farther and farther away from 2018, it's harder to say that number reflects the transition from before SROs to adding SROs, because all of the students now in middle school have now been in middle school always with SROs. So it's much more difficult to say what that number is, could be impacted by the sheer presence of SROs. But we do want to report that since we've been doing this measure, we have never seen that increase. And during that whole time, the number of calls for service leading to referrals has continued to go down at the high school level. So that's just a general understanding, not so much a takeaway specifically for this year. Now for the 4 overall takeaways. The first one has to do with suspensions. You've just heard about it, suspensions, where we've seen comparable numbers in 21, 22, and 22, 23 with some slight increases, and still the concern about disparity. And so there's a number of things, there's a number of things that we're looking at, but I want to add one piece of understanding to help frame the rest of the conversation. In Lincoln Public Schools, when we talk about our disciplines framework, we talk about an MTSSB pyramid, multiple tiered system of supports. So we have 3 tiers of support. The bottom tier it's broad because it impacts all the students, so it's impacting everyone, and it's broad because it's foundational. It's the proactive, pre-teaching, helping students learn how to be successful, how to behave successfully in school. So when the teacher teaches students the routines for the classroom that first day, that's a tier 1 support. You're helping teach students how to successfully maneuver what it is to be a student, how to sit in a circle, how to go to the lunchroom, how to go through the lunch line, how to be in the auditorium. Tier 1 supports. Tier 2 supports are when students start to have struggle, been tardy 4 times, been tardy 5 times. There's a group of students that all kind of fit that problem, and so we have group support. So we might have an after-school program, a lunch club, something where we try to support students in overcoming that particular issue. And then tier 3, which is most severe, and that's where a student has experienced behavioral issues that need an individual response. It's not really something a group can happen, it's individual. And this also includes the consequences that would be very much more severe and individuals, like a suspension, in school, out of school, or expulsion. So that's the framework, because I'm going to reference some of our approaches back to that. Because in responding to the suspension, that's not something new for 22-23. Lincoln Board of Education has already identified a goal as part of the All Means All action plan to reduce our overall suspensions by 20% and to eliminate the disparity below 1.2. So that's already been a goal that we are working on, and our recommendation is to continue those efforts as part of the All Means All action plan. And I just want to show you some of the things, some of the programs that have been put in place. So one is including more professional development on trauma-informed care and instructional practices for our administrators and all of our teachers. So this is tier 1 support. And so when you think of what do you mean by trauma-informed care, I'll give one example. Students who have dealt with trauma in their lives have a much more difficult time in dealing with quick changes to the environment or unstable environments. So an important trauma-informed care is once you've taught those routines, keeping similar and same routines and continuing to reteach those routines so students feel comfortable. They know how their environment works, they're comfortable in their environment, and they can be successful in that environment. That's one example of that broad, green level, tier 1 instructional support. And the more comfortable students are, the less likely they are to hit frustration and have behaviors raise up to suspendable levels. Another one is adding school social workers trained in conducting trauma-informed walkthroughs. So they're going through classrooms looking for those practices, providing feedback, providing support for teachers. And de-escalation training. As students start to move up the pyramid, now you're starting to work with them individually. The more you're able to help a student de-escalate, more you're able to problem solve and not have such severe issues. In addition, they also provided spring and summer staff development regarding restorative practices in school. An example of restorative practices, making things better. Student returning from, let's say, an out-of-school suspension, when they come back, they're just not walking to a classroom, but they're coming back to a restorative circle where there is an administrator, maybe a peer or favorite teacher that's there to support the student, a parent, others in the group to greet the student back, welcome them back, know they're wanted back in school, and to offer support. So as they transition back to school, they don't feel as though they're not wanted. Often a student that leaves school worries about feeling wanted coming back. This is to make sure you keep that positive relationship. Let's see if I'm at the right place. Okay. And I learned from Mr. Zabal, who's at the back of the room here, is our Director of Student Services, just asking for a quick kind of dipstick measure of how we are doing in those practices so far. And just the beginning of this year, I don't have the disparity data, but we're seeing a 19% increase in overall out-of-school suspensions K through 12, which is a really nice start to the year, and it's multiple years.
You said
decrease. Oh, sorry, decrease. Thank you. That's really decrease. 19% decrease in suspensions, which is a really nice start in looking how these practices impact what happens in our schools. We still don't know the disparity data. It's a quick dipstick look, but those are the directions we're starting to go. Then overall, takeaway 2, as we look at our disparity index for calls for service, for suspensions, we're still seeing that disparity. We have one group that's been able to move from outside from the disparity index to parity, the Hispanic racial demographic group. We've had a couple others improve, and some that have not improved. So we're not making the progress we had hoped in this area. So we're going to take a slightly different tack to what we've done before. In the suspension data, you saw this working very broad range, working at that tier 1 and tier 2 levels to provide broad services. What we're going to do is we looked at a preliminary data for the calls for service, and we identified that assaults was one of the higher areas of disparity when you looked at referral calls for services. So those for assaults. And so we're going to really do a deep dive of research into assaults, both what happens, how they get administered, so a suspension is determined, what kind of decisions are made to know they get referred to a school resource officer, and what decision is made to make a referral, to get a better understanding of that whole process and what are the root causes and basic functions of those behaviors, and then start to attack those and see if we can make a difference in our assault area disparity index and overall referrals and suspensions. We feel if we can get to the root cause and basic functions of those behaviors, we'll be able to reduce those, and if we can use that process and maybe some of those strategies as a template and then start attacking each of those areas to try to reduce that disparity index. Because as we've looked at broad practices in the past, we haven't seen the bump we've hoped to, like we've just seen suspension, so we're going to try to do this one at a time. Already some of this work has began because we see this data as we're building the report and want to start working on it. Again, in talking to Mr. Zabawa, right now we're experiencing a 36% reduction in suspensions for physical assault or fights. So it's a nice start for some of the practices that we're already putting in place, and we're hoping that also comes through in our disparity index. But that's a recommendation 2. Recommendation 1, broad programming across the whole pyramid, and then really targeted for assaults. In 3, we were very pleased in adding the question to the perception survey about whether you felt safe in school. And in fact, as soon as we had the question, then we said, ooh, what are some other questions we could ask? Because this is good data. So our recommendation for number 3, the takeaway is very effective, is we continue to look at additional questions that we can add that would be very meaningful. We have to be cautious not to overwhelm the people that are responding with too many questions. But when we have the right question, to add that question, because we also don't want to let go of any of our existing questions. We have good trend data and want to keep that trend data as well and not lose questions. And then our final is administrators were notified at 90% of all of our calls for service leading to referral. 10%, it was a question about whether they were notified or not. We have some data about those kind of instances. But we've really hung our hats on the professional development provided administrators in them making the decision about whether a school behavior should be referred to school resource officers. So our recommendation for next year is to look at how we record that information, so we're not just finding out whether an administrator was notified, but was the administrator a critical part of the decision-making process? And so that'll have us going into looking at how we identify that information in our actual reporting. So we better understand, are they the ones that are involved in the decision for something to be referred to a school resource officer? And there'll be always things that can't go to administrator. A student had their iPhone stolen, and so they just stop and see the school resource officer and turn in a complaint, I had something stolen. That doesn't need to go to administrator, so it won't ever be 100%, but we want to make sure those things where there's a question about whether it's school or not school are going through administrators. So those are our 4 main takeaways. And again, I'd like to thank Jeff Peterson and Tricia Todd, Rob McIntyre for their presenting tonight, Don Mazzi and Bethany Brunsman, who weren't here tonight, but were integral members of the evaluation team for what they've put together. And they'll all come join me as we'll try to answer questions, and I'll try to get my increases and decreases accurately described.
Sorry to holler at you.
Are there any
No,
questions?
that was a good one to catch.
Kathy?
I have a couple, and this is kind of a broad question about all of the data and how it's compiled. When we talk about incidents, are they one for one for if the same student commits 10 different incidents? Are they represented as the number of incidents, or is it the student? Is it by student? Like one student, even though they did it 10 times, or is it 10 times for them?
So I can answer for the call for service part of that. It's going on the incident. There could be 10 students that were on one call for service. There could be no students that were on a call for service. So, for example, the 265 calls for service with a referral, those are the incidents that are happening, not individuals.
So a repeat offender is going to show up 10 different times.
Potentially.
Okay, that was my first one. The second one was on data perception, so I get to go to Rob now.
Yeah.
You had paras, or you had certified staff, but I didn't see anything in there on classified staff.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've had a complaint at a couple board meetings about paras and they're in classrooms. Are we going to look at a way to gather that data? Is it bus drivers? I mean, sometimes there are types that aren't in the school building. Do we have a way to do that? Do we want to do that? Is it such a small minority that we wouldn't do it? That's the second part.
The answer to the first question is I don't think we have a way to do that. The answer to the second question is we can think about a way to do that. We could think about expanding the perception survey. I think it might need to be a very different survey, so that might need to be in development for a while, because I think we would need to ask some different questions than we would of certified staff. But we'll take that one away as a possibility. Yeah, thanks.
And the last one was on, let's see, never mind. Do we have enough personnel to implement all of these recommendations? Because as a board member, I look at it and we're asking our staff to do so much, but they're doing a lot more with less personnel over and over and over again. And that includes our SROs, but day to day teachers are are always already telling us this one person might take up 75% of their struggles during the day?
I'd say on a couple of things. One, there's been a huge investment by our Student Services Department that's been made possible by the board in the resources they provide to tackle some of these issues. And I think special kudos go out to Ryan Zabawa and his student service staff for providing leadership, and then the building principals in implementing this, because really what makes a difference is the classroom level. And teachers do an amazing job of every day being prepared to greet students, having a great environment, strong content experts, and then dealing with issues that are struggles for students in school. And our teachers are absolutely amazing in doing that work. So we have to be thoughtful and cautious in how much we ask, and really smart in only asking those things that we think are going to make a difference. And I think Mr. Zabawa has done an excellent job in making those discernments.
Agreed on that. Also relevant to staffing is the SROs themselves. The funding provided for school resource officers helps with workload, right? And we see that help with workload reflected in the perception survey. I think if we didn't have funding for SROs, the burden on LPS staff would be even greater.
And my last question is a little broader. It's probably because most of our data is done by ethnicity, race, poverty levels. What I don't see in there is kids who identify as LGBTQ. I don't see in there kids that are marginalized in some way, shape, or form. Is there ways that we can get information with all of this, with all of the discussion right now about hate crimes, about people attacking kids because of their religious beliefs, people attacking because they might be reading in the wrong book, because we might want to share? Is this something in the future that we need to probably make sure the kids know how to do the safe space and the takeaway on that?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, especially on the perception survey side, right? Where we definitely could add items. It would be possible to add items about, do you identify as, which of these groups do you identify with? It would absolutely be possible. What we've done so far, as Jeff referenced, is we stuck with census categories for race ethnicity, because there's plenty of other categories that students could identify, that families identify with, as far as different race ethnicities. Where we're at right now with the demographic categories is from the U.S. Census categories and the other, I'd call it objective measures of, does the student receive special education services? Does the student qualify for free reduced lunch? If we want to consider, and it might be a good idea to consider, adding items to the perception survey about other groups that a student identifies with, we would just want to work carefully with other people in LPS and work carefully with the board to make sure that we are asking in sensitive ways, and that we are judicious about the categories that we ask about, right? Because asking someone which groups they identify with on a self-perception survey can also influence their answers later on. And it can change their perception of safety for being honest later on in the survey. So we don't want to ask something that will backfire and reduce response rate and potentially color the inferences that we can make. So that's why we stuck with the race, ethnicity, and special education, ELL, and free reduced lunch categories that are already in our census files, basically, that are already in our student information system. But we're certainly open to that discussion, I think.
Yeah. I think we ask the questions we ask because those are the groups that are identified that we have to ask.
Yeah.
And so that gives people the confidence that we are not trying to dig and take information that schools and political subdivisions shouldn't be asking. So it is that careful balance. I think it's also a question, as we ask of smaller and smaller groups, the ability to actually display the data in any statistical form gets even more difficult.
Since I'm looking more for the safety of the kids
Mm-hmm.
and the staff, maybe it's just one of those questions you ask on an incident report. And maybe that's something they report and you just make note of it
Mm-hmm.
in a perception survey.
Yeah.
The last question, and that's just because what we implemented this year, and I saw a huge difference when I toured the high schools, was, did a cell phone make a big difference in how you act in school? Because I'll be curious to see if there's any data that comes up with that.
I don't have data to share with you right now. Is there any data yet, or all brand new?
I'm thinking
Yeah,
it might
it's
be
all,
2 to
we're
3
just
years
not,
down the
it's just
road,
not
but I
far
just-
enough along.
Because that was the one thing I noticed in the hallways. Kids were running to get to class. They weren't dawdling with their phones.
Yeah.
And it's very different than it was a year ago. So I would be curious to see if that made a difference.
And that speaks, it's, what's been so valuable is having this report be required, because now it's embraced with the data that it provides and what we can learn from it. So that's just another example of how data can help us do the right thing.
The other stuff is stuff I can call you on tomorrow.
And Ms. Danig, I just want to circle back to your first question. We do keep the data regarding individual students and what role they play in each incident. So if they're a victim or a suspect or a person's responsible, we do keep all of that. So we can kind of parse out if there's people that are showing up again and again.
And then we can also parse out hate crimes. Very few hate crimes occur in the city of Lincoln, but we have that data at our fingertips.
That makes me feel really, really comfortable.
Barb?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for all your work on this report. It's very thorough, and I'm glad that we're doing it, and I hope that we continue to do it, because I think we're learning things that surprise us. And the first thing that I want to call out, pardon me, is that the reality is that SROs are not part of the school to prison pipeline. I think that is huge, because as we went down that road, that was the community's largest concern. That does not mean we don't have disparities, and this report allows us to see that. And I serve on the school board. I'm deeply familiar with our All Means All plan, and was a huge advocate of that, and am very pleased at the different approaches that we're taking, and how some of that's getting some movement going. So I'm glad to, another reality is that expulsions are not pervasive. That's 0.3%. That's pretty good. I have a feeling that if other school districts and other police departments were doing this kind of data collection, that they wouldn't be competing with us in this realm. I have a feeling that we're working hard as a community to address these issues. Here's some suggestions along the way. Try to come upon your definitions of what you're studying. Keep them consistent. Don't change them. I like the idea of using the census definitions. But if we change them every few years, then we don't have the quality of data that we need to be able to do the progress that we need. I like the suggestion of maybe doing some bus review kind of thing, but that is a different issue than this issue, and I don't want them confused or combined, because those are separate issues, and the bus issue is kind of an LPS only thing. As for the smaller demographic groups, which may be inclusive of Native Americans, the LGBTQA community, and others, we may wish to go and, instead of having perception surveys, have the opportunity for some focus groups, so that we can get that feedback from those communities in their own words, so that we can hear it and that their voice doesn't get washed out by a majority community. We have a diversity cadre at LPS, and that would be a good starting point. But I would suggest that we look through that. Let me look at all my different the issue about tracking high-need students, and I want to talk about as high-need students, not as students who are causing all the problems, because I think that when youth engage in really negative antisocial behaviors, that we're talking about kids, and those are cries for help. So are we able to track our high needs students? Are we able to triage with those students? Because Mrs. Danick brings up a point that sometimes we board members will hear from our teacher contact teams that, you know, it's specific students that take up huge amounts of time. And in my mind, not only is that not fair to our teaching staff and their classmates, but that individual needs help. That person needs to be identified and helped in some way. So it would be a suggestion that if we can do some kind of identification of high needs students and triage them and get different kinds of supports for them, that might be very helpful for all concerned. Then also, I just want to point out that some things, unfortunately, our data shows us are things that we kind of already know. And that is that schools, education are experiencing a huge problem with boys and young men. And we're losing some. And I think this data supports that, and we need to not just blow that off as boys will be boys. Those are boys and young men that we're losing. And that's another form of that school to prison pipeline, but it's not a direct one with like our SROs. It's something larger than that. And I just want to call that out because I really think that we need to pay attention to the needs of boys and young men. Also, African American students and Native American students and those that are free and reduced lunch often come up in these data analysis. And again, and I already know that LPS, and I'm sure LPD does too, if these are issues that we need to get our hands around. So continue this awesome work. This is exactly what in 2018 I was hoping and praying for. So thank you so much.
Any other questions from the board? Brody?
Thank you, Chair Bowers, and thank you everyone in this room who's committed to keeping our students safe. I just have a few questions. The first one, referring to the calls for service that results in referrals, it looks like it's more likely to result in referral from an administrator than staff, even though it's initiated, or it's more likely to be initiated by staff than an administrator on the previous page, and I was just wondering what that's attributed to.
Regarding the who initiated calls for service versus who initiated call for service with a referral.
Yes, yep.
Kind of what I've seen in the data is when staff or teachers or other staff are initiating a call for service, that's coming from something that's happening right now in front of you. You see two kids fighting, you see a disturbance in the hallway, that something's happening immediate that the staff is initiating. And the ones that result in a referral, I think that we saw narcotics, 72% are coming from administrators. And that combined total on assaults, which is the highest call for service with referrals, I believe it was, over 30% is coming from administrators as well. The difference, I think, is the types of calls for service and the immediacy of their need for help.
Okay, that's very helpful. And then my other question is, I see that all the SRO complaints that we had were exonerated, and I'm just wondering who determines that and how is that determined?
That's determined through our internal affairs department, so they're investigating that. Each case that comes forward, they do the interviews, they do the report, and it goes up through the chain of command, and that's how the investigation is completed.
Awesome, thank you. And then my last question, the perception when it came to SRO presentations, that stood out to me, right? That it's such a large number of individuals who don't feel like there's been a presentation. And I just wonder, is that truly a perception, or is that maybe a reality that these presentations aren't happening?
We believe that we have some work to do with gathering the data from that aspect. And we've been working with Lieutenant Armstrong to try to get the word out on making sure we're documenting properly. So we do believe there's some work to be done on documenting. Now, I could be wrong in that aspect, but we'll report out at a later time for how we think this process could be improved. I know we're going to talk about it in the future.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I really appreciate all of your guys' work on this, and that was all of my questions.
Any other questions, Mayor Larian?
Thank you so much for such a comprehensive report, and I would share Board Member Byer's gratitude for how responsive this reporting is to the community engagement that occurred when this board was first initiated and created, and having this kind of enduring commitment and to not only transparency but to analysis and continuous improvement is really impressive. I just had one question that has a little bit to do more with maybe my lack of familiarity with some of the terminology that you use at LPS, and on slide 82 where you're talking about even more commitment to professional development, which is great. Can you share a little bit more about what provision of opportunities means versus uptake or utilization or even requirement? To what extent, when you provide training opportunities to staff and administrators, does that translate into everyone actually utilizes that training? What does that
I'm
look
not
like
sure
for you?
which one it's referring to. Some aspects are offered to students, so they're provided the opportunity. One will be an example where I think it was restorative practices, where every administrator was offered the opportunity for the training, or took the training, and then teachers were offered, and it listed the number, maybe 452 actually took advantage of the training. It goes back a little bit to what Mrs. Danek was saying, and sometimes we have the ability to say we have the resources, the staff, and the contract time to say, you will take part in this training. And other times it's something that takes time over years because it has to be offered as an opportunity. And over time, through a combination of teachers choosing that as part of their optional opportunity, or as it becomes part of staff meetings, we more slowly get all the teachers on board. So it is offered in different ways.
Okay. Is that something you monitor? Do you look over time for people who are staying on staff over time? If you start to see that there hasn't been utilization, is that something where you might actually encourage to try to make sure there's more broad uptake of the training and professional
I'm
development?
going to look over my shoulder to Mr. Zabawa and to
Okay.
see if there's a way that, what's the best way to describe that?
So we have embedded 4 opportunities.
Why don't you come on up? I'm sorry. Thank you.
We want to make sure all of our staff are getting trained. So this year we have embedded 4 opportunities for all LPS staff to be trained around restorative practices throughout the course of the school year. So we're going to continue to make sure that there's a minimum standard of training for all of our staff in this area.
And I think I'm pretty clear on the answer to this, but just for the public, because we have very few number of SROs who actually are in the schools relative to LPS staff, all of our SROs do receive comprehensive training about working with youth. You just wanted to confirm that for...
Yep, without a doubt. 48 hours this past school year.
Okay, great.
And that requirement is 20 hours, so they're over double their hour requirement for training for SROs.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Any other questions, Mayor? Payush, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have some questions, and these may be because of my newness and lack of familiarity about the process. One question I have is, what are the boundaries of these incidents? Like, do they have to happen within the school premises? What about when the kids are walking home after school? What about things that happen, via phone? Could you please help me understand that?
Sure. So our officers use a location code for public middle schools or high schools. So if a student is let's say a missing person, and they were supposed to be picked up from school, but they're nowhere to be found when their parent or guardian shows up, that's going to be a missing person from the school, because that's where they're going to be reported missing from. As far as students walking away from the schools, if it's not happening on school property, it's not being counted towards the calls for service here. This is at the school or on the school grounds.
It doesn't have to be during a school day, though.
Correct. It doesn't have to be during the school day. It's anything that's happening during the school year. So the LPS start date and the LPS end date, we take all calls for service that happened in those dates, no matter what time. We review all of those.
Thank you. Another question I have is that there were 2,701 presentations, or rather students that were part of the presentations. I'm curious, how are those selected? Like, where are these presentations taking place? Are they in classrooms, and how do we select where should we go?
We suspect this is probably pretty different school by school. It's probably dependent on the relationship between the SRO and administrators, and SROs offering presentations. But you also notice that that's a takeaway. That is one thing that we want to look at more closely in the future in order to figure out how the presentations are offered, who's initiating presentations, whether that's something that administrators tailor with the SRO or whether that's based on specific expertise of the SRO. So listen for more of that next year.
All right.
I'll give you one example. One that happened to be at a middle school was they used a car, they made skid marks, and then students figured out from the length of the skid marks and the statistics that went with the car, how fast the car had to have been going to create those skid marks. And it was from an 8th grade algebra class using the formula that they were using in class. That's an example of how you take the expertise that an officer might have because they used to be on traffic duty, take that expertise, and it had a great match with the class. So some of it depends on what expertise the school resource officer happens to bring to that school as well.
And my last question is, you talked about when does the SRO or LPS gets in contact with the student or the parent. How is it determined who would contact the LPS, administrator or SRO?
If it's considered school discipline, the school administrator would make the contact in dealing with the particular issue. And
I very much believe over the past year, at least during the summer months, there was some good discussion on how to handle some of these calls for service that initiated some type of discipline or the referral. And I think some of the training reflected that when there is a referral, we need to get the administrator involved, and the administrator needs to be part of that decision. And that was one of our takeaways last year that we discussed on these referrals, and making sure the administrators are part of that decision-making process.
So a high level of cooperation between the SRO and an administrator in contacting the family.
That's what I was wondering. So there is a discussion between the two, and then it is decided who would make the call. That's all I had. Thank you.
Barb?
Yeah, my follow-up is that this is a great report, and each year we need to vote on contracts. And you all know that I have been critical because I don't have the data. But now we're back to reality from the pandemic. We now have data. So I encourage you to provide, maybe not quite this deep a dive, but the report to this board, the school board, city council, so everybody understands what we have done, where we're improving. I think there's a lot of good news in this report. Again, I want to emphasize that SROs are not part of the school to prison pipeline. Got to remember that. And then that we have expulsions down to 0.3%. That's great. But then you were talking about these different interventions from the All Means All initiative, and that we're starting to see improvements. And I really want the public and all the elected representatives to hear this important information, Because I think it's spectacular that we're wrapping our arms around this issue and creating accountability and transparency. The most important thing is that we're saving kids, and that's what is the beauty of data. So thank you.
Kathy?
Just one last thing. This is more of a big thank you, and it's a wraparound thank you. The Safe and Successful Kids Interlocal started as a partnership between the city and the school board because there was an abiding fear in the community about keeping our kids safe when they were at school and making sure it's done. And being able to track that was how we made it even more intense. But the reality it came from parents screaming at us, make sure my kids are safe. It happened after school shootings. It happened after they saw events that were occurring. Not in Lincoln, Nebraska, but nobody here wants those events in Lincoln, Nebraska. So on behalf of myself, probably my colleagues, I just want to say thank you, because the SSKI board across this nation is a model for the rest of the country. It started trying to save our CLCs, which are part of this. It ended up adding the SROs, and this partnership is immensely successful in doing all of the things that this SKI board was intended to do. So thank you to all of you for all the work that you've done.
And if I could just respond, I think it's important to note that some of the success that we have here is a result of other parts of SSK that impact this. If it wasn't for the counselors and the therapists and the social worker and threat assessment staff that are also funded through SSK, and if it wasn't part of the CLC providing safe and enriching opportunities for kids after school, this data would also look different. So while we present the reports one at a time, all three programs interact with each other to help provide those positive results. So thank you for bringing that up.
Any other questions from the board at this time? I just had a couple of quick questions. When we talk about the student perception data and the staff perception data, can you explain to me a little bit about and I'm not a statistician, so I'm going to get this wrong, for the student, the marking of it or the scale, it goes not at all true, somewhat true, mostly true, completely true. Mm-hmm. For staff, it goes strongly disagree, agree, strongly agree. Mm-hmm. Like at first glance of this, it seems like there's almost a possibility of not as many options for students to maybe say that they more of a disagree as opposed to not at all. So can you help me understand that a little bit more?
Yeah, and different items on different items on the perception survey have different Likert or Likert scales there. So the intent is definitely not to put our thumb on the scale for one group and not the other group. For specific items, the way the items are worded, we tailor the scale to those items. So we could look, and maybe we can do a follow-up on the specific items that use a different scale to make sure it's consistent between the student and the staff survey. So I can take that away and I can look at that, but we generally use the same scale for the same item across all three surveys.
Awesome. Good. Yeah, because I mean, like, when we talk about grouping those three together,
yeah,
of course it's going to seem imbalanced, and with the staff one having different options. Mm-hmm. I don't know. That was just interesting to look at. Another question that I had was for schools that have a high rate of disciplinary measures, either in-school suspension or out-of-school suspension, what kind of supports does the district provide individual schools?
That one? Okay.
Yeah, Ryan Zababa, Director of Student Services for Lincoln Public Schools. The question, can you repeat that for me one more time?
Yeah, so for schools that have like a higher rate of disciplinary actions, either like in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, or expulsions, just by maybe they have a disproportionate amount of students in that building, what kind of supports do those buildings receive as opposed to other buildings?
Generally, the support's really all the same. I mean, we have student support rooms, we have in-school suspension spaces. It's more about the training around restorative practices for all staff. We also do have some coaches that can go in to those buildings and provide support for that support staff and those administrators to help those students be more successful.
I guess I was thinking not necessarily even for the students, but for like the staff, right? Does the building get more points, more staffing availability? Are they targeted more for more mental health options, right? Like, Is that something that currently exists?
Yeah, when we take a look at mental health options, we look at that need based on that building, and we do allocate social worker FTE based on building's needs, and in some cases, their discipline data and free and reduced lunch populations. Yeah.
Is there any resources or options that aren't being provided that if money wasn't an issue that would be provided to those schools?
Yeah, absolutely. Additional staff would be amazing in those spaces, and it really comes down to finding individuals and the resource to be able to offer those to those buildings.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Thanks.
you bet.
Another question that I had is, I know that on the calls for service, you said that it was per incident. For the school disciplinary reports for out of school or in school, is that also per incident or is that per student?
For the suspension.
I was still thinking about your previous question. I'm making sure we're not changing scales on different items, so I'm going through it in my head. Sorry, James.
For the disciplinary reports for the schools for middle and high school, I know the calls for service were per incident. For the expulsions out of school and in school, is that per incident also, or is that per student?
Per student.
Per student? Okay.
All unique.
And one thing I noticed, and again, I'm not a statistician, so I could be way off base, when I was looking, not necessarily at the ethnicity data, but when I was looking at the data for special education, ELL, and free and reduced lunch, it almost seems like that there's more of a disproportionate as it relates to middle school instead of high school, right? So like for middle school, I'm just picking up a random one, expulsion was like at 31%, whereas high school is at 21% for special education.
Yeah.
What do you think, why do you think that exists, that there's a higher disproportion in middle school as opposed to high school?
These would be guesses at this point, so we might have to take a deeper dive. There's very possible that more students participate in special education services in middle school, and sometimes students graduate out or work their way out of special education services by the time they're participating in high school. It's also true of the free reduced lunch program. As students mature and take more specialized classes, sometimes students don't participate in those types of services as much as they get older, but we might have to look at that more closely to see if my guess is right.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Last question that I had was, with MTS SB, and I know that there's no way to mark all the data for this, but I'm just kind of curious about opinions or impressions. Are the students that are receiving disciplinary actions, are those typically students that are at tier 3, tier 2, or how many of those tier 1 students that kind of have been under the radar then come around as a result of disciplinary action as opposed to preventative? Does that make sense? And again, I know there's no data. I'm just kind of curious for,
I would say the majority, when we see repeat offenses, would be our tier 2 and tier 3 students.
Okay, so not a lot of the tier 1 that just kind of fly under the radar, and then
Correct.
the next thing you know, they're receiving an out-of-school suspension.
Correct.
Those are the only questions I had. Thank you so much. All right, last call for questions. Okay, seeing none. Is there anyone from the public that wishes to testify or provide public comment on this? Okay. Seeing none, thank you so much for the report and for all that you do and for providing information. Since there's no public comment or no one here to provide public comment, we'll move into adjournment. The next meeting is scheduled for Thursday, February 22nd at 12:15 here in the City Council chambers. The focus of that meeting will be reviewing the annual report for the Community Learning Centers Initiative. With that being said, I would ask for a motion to adjourn. Moved by Kathy, seconded by Payush. Any discussion? Seeing none, may we please do a roll call vote?
Barb,
Yes.
James Michael,
Yes.
Kathy,
Yes.
Larian, Brody.
Yes.
All right, we'll see you all February.